Liz Peterson, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm so excited about what you bring to the table, and I'm so impressed with your body of work. So thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited that you asked.
So Liz, let's get started right off the bat. And for those of you who may not know you, can you give us a little bit of background as far as what you do and what brings you to the table today?
Sure. Yes, I am the Assistant Director of the Houston Coalition Against Hate. We're a network of organizations, institutions, and individuals working together to combat hate and promote belonging in the city of Houston. And I also do anti racism consulting on the side. And I work with primarily churches, but also organizations and individuals who are looking to explore their white identity and how to unlearn some of the racist programming that we all have just from living in the United States.
So you've been really busy lately.
Yes.
How long have you been doing this,
Yeah.
Liz? I'm curious.
I was activated in 2016 with the death of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. That was when I had my personal awakening.
So that was one of the things that I was very curious about because it seems like everybody has that one, reflective moment where they realize, hey, I need to help the work along somehow. And so it sounds like you had that moment, huh?
Yes, yes, it was a very specific moment for me. I don't know why, but I was in bed and I was, looking at my phone. I should have been sleeping. And I came upon a video of Alton Sterling's teenage son, and he was crying while his mother was speaking at a press conference. And the son was, he was a young man. He was um, tall and broad, and he was wearing a polo shirt, and he was crying into it. And there was something so moving to me about that image of his grief, and it just occurred to me like there is no reason that he's him and I'm me, and he's dealing with what he has, and I live in this life of privilege. And I just felt called from that moment to start doing something.
I'm curious. So prior to that moment, had you had any curiosity or an inclination towards doing this type of work? Or is it just really that day it was born for you?
Well, I would say that, I've always been a very compassionate person and a very empathetic person. And so prior to that moment, I would consider myself a good liberal, a good person, a good progressive person who didn't have a racist bone in my body, if you will. And, my area that I thought that I would help the world, I always wanted to help the world, was education. And I was actually pursuing, I guess I had just completed a master's degree in education. And my plan was to go into the classroom when my daughter, who was an infant at that time, went into kindergarten. And I had planned to work in an urban setting. I always had this, um, my parents in instilled in me, a deep desire to help people. And so I'm so glad God didn't grant me that wish that I had at that time, because I think I probably would have taken a lot of harmful programming into the classroom, and
Mm.
done some of the things that I caution people against now. But anyway, the time was the time that led me down the path that I am on, and I didn't go into the classroom. Instead, I went into this anti-racism training.
That's so interesting. I'm always fascinated again by not just that those moments of humanity that I think people have, but really what led them to that moment of realization that, hey, in my own little way, I can help the work along. That's pretty neat. Thank you for sharing, Liz. I'm very curious. So the title of this series is "Grace in Polarizing Times," and all I can
Mm-hmm.
do is have assumptions on what happens when you go into an organization or a audience and facilitate these conversations. Is grace something that you see present? And if so, how is that manifested in what you see daily?
To me, grace is absolutely crucial in the work that I do. I don't think I could get through a day without grace, both grace being given to me and grace being extended by me toward other people. We have to have grace with ourselves when we're having these hard conversations, when we're learning or unlearning what we thought we knew about the world, when we're making mistakes. If I quit every time I felt embarrassed about something that I said or did, it would be so easy to quit every time I said or did something that was embarrassing. And yet, the call for justice is to continue in the work and to pick yourself up and move forward. And so, people have extended me grace for times when I have overstepped my bounds, made an assumption that I shouldn't have based on the cultural misunderstanding, when I have just plain put my foot in my mouth. And I try to extend that same grace to those people that I'm teaching as they move along. I don't expect you to go from knowing, nothing about race and racism to, leading a scholarly panel on the dynamics of critical race theory. I just try to move the dial like little by little, so that people are a little bit more aware and a little bit more engaged in righting some of these societal wrongs. So grace is everywhere to me in this work.
You talked about extending it to yourself. What do you mean by that?
I mean, there is so much in society today, I think, that tells us we need to be perfect. And part of that desire to be perfect makes us afraid of trying new things or of doing anything that we don't already know how to do. And I think that's one reason why white people don't like to talk about race. And this was something that I learned from the book Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, which I would highly recommend to any white folks who are just beginning their exploration of their racial identity. And what she talks about is how that fear of being wrong and that fear of ever feeling bad or feeling ashamed stops us from moving into any dynamic in which we're not the majority, in which we're not the cultural norm, and of exploring anything within us that might have prejudice, have biases, our fear of that self disappointment or that self awareness can be so overwhelming. And I just tell people that you have to give yourself the grace to know that you now that you know better, you can do better, which is just a butcher of Maya Angelou's quote.
That's really, really good advice. I think what happens is, I know for me personally, I have to really keep in mind that, hey, it's people being people, and like you said earlier, it's something that needs to be extended both ways. The difficulty in that is keeping that in mind when you're going through the very visceral process of either listening to something that you really didn't like, that just rubbed you the wrong way, versus maybe what your intentions are for facilitating that conversation. There's the process of people being people is not easy, and so to keep all in
Absolutely.
mind is no easy task. It definitely takes practice. So thank you for sharing that. Another question that I have for you is, so what are some of the difficulties that you encounter in your work that keep people from either showing grace or even sometimes receiving grace and being okay with what that feels like?
That is a great question. I think the fear and the perfectionism that I just mentioned is a big one. Another thing I think is we become so trapped in our dichotomous thinking that there is only one right answer. And what we have to learn what I had to learn when I began doing this work, is that there are many answers and there are many ways to experience the world, and every one of them is valid. And as long as we're stuck saying there can only be one right person or there can be only one right experience, that makes it very, very hard to extend the grace to someone who's telling you that your experience, while valid, is not the way they experience the world, and um, that refusal to see any nuance in political conversations are almost impossible right now, because we have the president, sort of casting a pall on racism training as being anti-American. And I was just speaking in the other podcast that Victor and I do together about how you can be a proud American. My brother's in the armed services, and my father, my grandfather, both of my grandfathers served in the military. You can love your country and expect it to reckon with its racist past. And people don't see how you can live in those kind of nuances.
Yeah, that's really, really spot on. One of the things that I think we all struggle with is exactly that, is we're so comfortable with living in extremes. And if you're this, well, then you can't be that. And it keeps me from being
Absolutely.
able to see this perspective and that perspective. And again, going back to my earlier point, realizing that is one, but then applying it on a regular basis is not something that just happens overnight. It's a constant process. It's being reflective of who you are. I know for me, sometimes it's almost a detriment, just because I naturally am that type of person that will relive a conversation many more
Mm,
times, trying to dissect it, trying to really learn something from it, something that I can take from it, you know. So
mm,
that's really, really good. One of the other things that I really see as a difficulty that I was very appreciative that you did with your series with Victor is the knowledge portion of it, the language. A lot of times we tend to think about the bigger ideas that keep us from
mhm,
even sitting at the table. I'm not saying agreeing on everything, I'm just saying being willing to sit at the same table to listen to one another is the language. We'll focus on all these big terms like BIPOC and this and that, the other. And for people who are in this space, it's something that happens seamless. But for someone that's listening to it for the first time, it's like any other space. I can't feel
yeah.
very comfortable when I'm not aware of the simple things like language. So I was very appreciative of what you guys did with sharing the terms and the history behind racism and all those terms. I think you guys did a phenomenal job. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for saying that. It is so important. And when you say that some of these words, they can mean vastly different things to different people. And then you're not even having a productive conversation at all, because you're just running around semantics.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really important.
So we talked about grace and how you see it daily and some of the obstacles. You alluded to the polarizing time right now around politics, where it's very difficult to have conversations. Do you have any tangible strategies that people can listen to this and walk away from having felt confident in applying those strategies in their day-to-day interactions?
Hmm. Um, it's more of a mindset than a strategy. Um, I just try to tell people it's like building a muscle, working out, running a race. If you're going to run a marathon, I make I always think that, especially on beautiful fall days like this, that I should register for the half marathon and become a long distance runner. And I put on my shoes and I go out there and I am like dragging after a mile and a half, but maybe I can finish 3 miles because I used to run cross country. But the next day, my body is mad at me. And that's kind of what I tell people about doing this work, is to take it in stages and to view it as a long-term investment. And so if you are just exploring these things, know that one of the first things that we do psychologically to protect ourselves from the hurt feelings that come from realizing that, as particularly as white people, that we do have some of these biases, or we have behaved in problematic ways in the past, is to get really, really hyper focused on everyone else in our life and how very deeply racist they are, because that makes it a lot easier for us to then say, well, at least I'm not that. And what we really have to do is focus on ourselves, and that's not to say that we don't want to have these conversations with other people. You do, but you're not going to solve your parents, your grandparents' views in one conversation in one day. They're not going to magically wake up and say, you're right. 75 years of cultural programming has been lying to me, and your 5-minute conversation did the trick. So just every day, try to do something a little bit better every day. I love that you're talking about grace. Give yourself grace to keep going. And you'll be amazed over the course of time that I've been doing this, the conversations I never imagined I would have been able to have with my own parents, who are much more conservative than I am politically, but who the space has been made for me to offer them a new perspective. And my dad told me it was one of the most touching moments of our relationship when he told me that, he had never really known a lot of Black people. And so what he knew about Black people, he was realizing came from TV, and he was seeing how that wasn't maybe an accurate reflection of the entirety of Black American culture. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but just even having that recognition for someone can be really huge. And so that's what I would say. Just look at it as a marathon and not a sprint.
I absolutely love your advice, because you're right. We tend to gravitate to those very urgent things. Maybe something came up on the news or our social media, and we want to tackle those. And I think really you have the right idea, is really developing that relationship, because that's going to in turn open up those roads and avenues for other conversations, and just kind of chunking at it a little bit at a time, and again, keeping in mind that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. People get passionate, or they get their feelings hurt, and they immediately want to jump, like I said, to the big ideas, the big topics, and forget that, hey man, this is what I can do, right now within my space. I think right now that just kind of looks a lot differently because of COVID, and it's just kind of thrown us for a loop. The good thing is now we've been in this space for a while. We're doing things like this where, I know I'm very grateful for this aspect, because otherwise I don't know that I would have reached out. Victor and I have known each other for a long time, and it wasn't until this happened that I decided to reach out. So I absolutely love your advice. That's really, really good. Thank you for that. Liz, thank you so much for your time with us. I really appreciate it. And if you're open to it, I'm sure that I'll invite you in the future, because I think you have some
Yeah,
really,
I'd
really
be happy
neat
to come back.
perspectives.
You're doing important work too.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Liz. See you.